Have you ever had to deal with an HOA? It's a special kind of misery, isn't it? A little slice of suburban tyranny run by people with too much time on their hands and a deep-seated desire to measure your grass with a ruler. But I think I might hold the record for the most explosive, most satisfying, and most legally binding shutdown of an HOA president in history. She tried to have me arrested for refusing to leave my own property, not realizing that when I said I owned the lake, I wasn't just talking about the shoreline in my backyard. The story is a little crazy, a little complicated, but stick with me, because the ending is worth it. And hey, while you're settling in, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. It all started when I came home. For me, home wasn't just a town, it was a legacy. My great-grandfather, a man with more foresight than a chess grandmaster, had purchased a vast tract of untouched timberland and a pristine glacial lake about a century ago. He didn't just build a house, he built a future. He founded the town, plotted the grid, and his company, Northwood Development, methodically and ethically developed the region over the next several decades. The crown jewel of his life's work was the estate he built on the westernmost point of the lake, a sprawling stone and timber masterpiece he simply called The Point. This was the house I grew up in. The house my family had occupied for 4 generations. After a long career overseas as a civil engineer, working on massive infrastructure projects in Europe and Asia, I was finally back. My parents had retired to a warmer climate, and the keys to The Point were now mine. I was 45, single, and looking forward to a life of quiet mornings, good coffee, and the familiar sound of water lapping against the old stone breakwater. The community that had sprung up around the lake, Eagle Landing, was a Northwood development project from the late 1980s. It was designed to be an idyllic, upscale community. And for the most part, it was. But somewhere along the line, a tumor had grown in its heart: the Eagle Landing Homeowners Association. My family had, of course, established the HOA, but it was intended to be a bare-bones entity responsible for maintaining the front gate, the private roads, and the small community clubhouse. It was never meant to be a micro-government, but power, as they say, abhors a vacuum. I'd been back for less than a month when I got my first taste of the new regime. It was a crisp, official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside, a letter printed on heavy cardstock informed me that I was being fined $50 for an unapproved mailbox modification. I stared at the letter, then at my mailbox. It was the original, a heavy, cast-iron box set into a fieldstone pillar, installed by my great-grandfather in 1928. It had the family initial N forged into the door. Apparently, it didn't conform to the new, standardized bronze letterbox required by Article 7, Section 4 of the revised HOA bylaws. I chuckled, tossed the letter in the recycling bin, and forgot about it. That was my first mistake. The second notice came 2 weeks later, this time for $100. It was accompanied by a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my boat. I owned a 1962 Riva Aquarama, a classic Italian mahogany speedboat that my grandfather had bought new. It was a floating piece of art, all gleaming wood and polished chrome. The violation? Unapproved watercraft livery. The bylaws, the letter sternly informed me, stipulated that all boats docked on the lake should have predominantly white hulls to maintain aesthetic harmony. My boat, a masterpiece of natural wood grain, was apparently an eyesore. This time, I didn't chuckle. I felt a flicker of annoyance. These people were serious. The woman behind this crusade, I soon learned, was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the HOA. She was a caricature of the nouveau riche, a woman who seemed to believe that a platinum card and a perpetually condescending sneer were substitutes for a personality. She drove a pristine white Range Rover that was always, without fail, parked diagonally across 2 spaces at the community clubhouse. She and her husband, a silent, perpetually startled-looking man named Gary, had bought one of the newer McMansions on the opposite side of the lake about 8 years prior. From what the older residents told me, Brenda had seized control of the HOA board like a barnacle, attaching itself to a ship's hull, slowly, tenaciously, and with the ultimate goal of becoming an immovable fixture. Our first face-to-face meeting happened a week later. I was down on my dock, meticulously polishing the chrome on the Riva, when the electric hum of a golf cart announced her arrival. She glided to a stop at the edge of my lawn, the cart's tires barely disturbing the manicured grass. She didn't get out. She just sat there, sunglasses the size of dinner plates obscuring her eyes, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "You must be the new owner," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had a grating quality, like nails on a chalkboard, but with an unearned sense of authority. I straightened up, wiping my hands on a rag. "I'm not new. I'm just back. And you are?" I knew perfectly well who she was. "I'm Brenda," she announced, as if I should be asking for her autograph. "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." She gestured vaguely with a manicured hand toward my house. "We've sent you a couple of notices. They don't seem to have been received with the appropriate level of attention." "Oh, I received them," I said, my tone placid. "I just filed them under amusingly irrelevant. My mailbox is a historical fixture, and my boat is a classic. Neither of them are changing." Her lips tightened even further. "Mister? I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "It's Northwood," I said, "like the development company." A flicker of something confusion, annoyance, crossed her face before being smoothed over with more condescension. "Well, Mr. Northwood, historical doesn't mean exempt. The rules are the rules. They exist to protect our property values. Your property values exist because of the standards my family set when they built this place," I replied, my patience beginning to thin. "And those standards didn't include dictating the color of a man's boat." This was the wrong thing to say. Her entire posture stiffened. "The community has evolved. We have standards now, higher standards. You need to bring your property into compliance. The mailbox, the boat, and—" She paused for dramatic effect. "The dilapidated structure at the end of your property." She pointed a long, accusatory finger at my old boathouse. The boathouse was a stone and cedar structure built at the same time as the main house. It was weathered, yes, but it was structurally sound and beautiful in its own right. It sat right on the water, and it was my next big project. I had the original blueprints and intended to restore it to its former glory, complete with a new copper roof and restored boat lift. "The boathouse is my next project," I said coolly. "I'm restoring it." "You will do no such thing," she snapped. "That structure violates at least a dozen current setback and shoreline construction ordinances. It's an eyesore and a liability. The board has voted to have it torn down. We'll be sending a contractor in next month. We'll of course have to bill you for the demolition." I just stared at her. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. It was like a mosquito telling an elephant it was parked in the wrong spot. She was telling me, on my own ancestral land, that she was going to tear down a building my great-grandfather had built with his own hands and then send me the bill. This wasn't about property values. This was a power play. She saw the biggest, oldest property on the lake, and she saw it as the ultimate symbol of her authority to conquer. She wanted to prove to everyone that no one, not even the owner of the founder's estate, was above her reach. I gave her a slow, deliberate smile. It wasn't a friendly one. "Brenda, let me be very clear. If you or any contractor you hire sets one foot on my property with the intent to demolish my boathouse, I will treat it as a criminal act. This conversation is over." I turned my back on her and went back to polishing the chrome on my boat. I could feel her glare burning into my spine. After a moment of sputtering silence, the golf cart whirred away. The battle lines had been drawn. She thought this was a fight about bylaws and property maintenance. She had absolutely no idea that she had just declared war on the very foundation the ground beneath her feet was built on. She was about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson about the difference between a rule book and a master deed. And I, the quiet engineer who just wanted to be left alone, was about to become her worst nightmare. The letter from the HOA's law firm arrived a week later, delivered by certified mail. It was exactly what I expected, a formal, 10-page, long litany of legal threats, pseudo-legal jargon, and outright fabrications. It cited various sections of the Eagle Landing Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC rupees, claiming my boathouse was in gross violation of shoreline construction codes, setback requirements, and aesthetic standards. It stated I had 30 days to either submit a remediation plan for its complete removal, or the HOA would exercise its right to remedy by demolishing the structure and placing a lien on my property for the Bayplains alleged cost. The arrogance was stunning. They were asserting rights they simply didn't possess, banking on the assumption that the threat of lawyers and liens would be enough to make me fold. This is how bullies operate, with overwhelming force and the belief their victim is too weak or too intimidated to fight back. Brenda had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. I read the letter over a cup of coffee on my veranda, the boathouse sitting stoically in the distance. The letter was a declaration of war, and I had no intention of fighting a defensive battle. My entire career had been about understanding the fundamental structures of things how bridges are supported, how dams hold back immense pressure, how foundations must be built on solid bedrock. An HOA is a legal structure, and I knew its foundation had to be somewhere. Brenda was operating on the flimsy surface level, on bylaws her cronies had passed last year. I was going to go deeper. I was going to find the bedrock. My first step was simple. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. I drove into town and went to the county records office. It was a dusty, quiet place that smelled of old paper and history. The county clerk, a woman named Margaret, had been there for 40 years. Her father had been the clerk before her, and her grandfather had been one of the first men my great-grandfather hired to help survey the county lines. When I walked in, she looked up over her spectacles, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Well, I'll be," she said, her voice warm. "James Northwood, you look more like your father every year. I heard you were back. It's good to have a Northwood at the point again." "It's good to be back, Margaret," I said, shaking her hand. "I need to pull some records. The original master deeds and covenants for the Northwood Lake Development Project. Everything from the initial filing in the 60s through the transfer to the first homeowners association in the late 80s. Margaret nodded knowingly. "Having a bit of trouble with the new queen over at Eagle Landing, are we? You're not the first." That woman thinks the HOA bylaws are holy scripture. She led me back into the archives, a climate-controlled room filled with massive rolling shelves of bound volumes and plat maps. "It's all in here," she said, gesturing to a specific section. "Your family was meticulous. Every document, every survey, every easement is cross-referenced. If you're looking for the foundation, son, this is the quarry." For the next 3 days, that archive became my office. I methodically pulled every document related to Eagle Landing. I started with the original land grants and surveys from the early part of the century, establishing the unimpeachable ownership of the entire basin by the Northwood Corporation. Then I moved forward in time, tracing the lineage of the land. I found the master plan for the Northwood Lake community filed in 1986. And then, I found it, the document I was looking for. It was titled Master Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Eagle Landing. This was the source code. This was the constitution upon which the entire HOA was built. Any bylaws they created had to be subordinate to this document. If a bylaw contradicted the master declaration, it was legally void. My heart beat a little faster as I carefully turned the thick, time-yellowed pages. It was all there. The establishment of common areas, the rules for road maintenance, the initial architectural guidelines. And then, on page 4, under a section titled Applicability and Exemptions, I found the smoking gun. It was clause 2.7, and it was so clear and unambiguous it might as well have been written in neon lights. It read, "The parcel of land designated as Lot 1 on the master plat map, known historically and herein referred to as the Point or the Founder's Parcel, along with all existing and future structures thereupon, is hereby and forever exempt from any and all articles, covenants, conditions, restrictions, and assessments of the Eagle Landing Homeowners Association, its successors, or any governing body that may be formed hereafter. The Founder's Parcel shall not be subject to the authority of the association in any manner whatsoever." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. I had it. It was a kill shot. My property wasn't just grandfathered in. It was legally firewalled off from the HOA's existence from the moment of its conception. My great-grandfather, with his characteristic foresight, had ensured that his own home would never be subject to the whims of a committee. Brenda's letters, her threats, the lawyers blustering it was all built on a foundation of sand. She didn't just have no jurisdiction. The master declaration explicitly forbade her from even attempting to claim it. I photocopied the entire document, then had Margaret officially certify the copies with the county seal. This was my shield. But as I sat there, a different feeling began to settle in. This wasn't just about me anymore. As I'd been digging, I'd read through the rest of the master declaration. I saw the original intent. The HOA was supposed to have strict limits on its ability to levy fines, clear rules on financial transparency, and a primary mission of maintenance, not enforcement. The thing Brenda was running bore little resemblance to the entity my family had authorized. She had twisted it into her own personal fiefdom, and other people, good people, who didn't have a magic exemption clause, were suffering under her rule. I'd heard the whispers. Old man Hemlock, a retiree on a fixed income, was fined into debt over the color of his petunias. The Miller family was forced to tear down a perfectly safe treehouse their kids adored. This had to stop. Vindicating myself wasn't enough. I had to dismantle her entire corrupt system for the good of the whole community. So I went deeper. If she was this brazen about rules, she was probably just as brazen with the money. It was time for phase 2 of the operation. I thanked Margaret, took my certified documents, and made 2 calls. The first was to Arthur Fincher, my family's lawyer for over 50 years. He was semi-retired but lived for this kind of fight. The second was to a forensic accounting firm in the city, the best in the state. I explained the situation to both. Arthur was practically giddy. "Oh, this is beautiful, James." He cackled over the phone. "It's a classic case of ultra-vires, acting beyond one's legal power. But the fraud angle, that's the real stinger. Let them dig. Let's see what they find." I sent the accounting firm the last 3 years of the HOA's financial statements, which I was entitled to as a homeowner, a fact I was sure Brenda would conveniently forget. I also gave them a few interesting tidbits I'd picked up. The name of the ridiculously overpriced landscaping company the HOA used. The contractor who was paid a fortune for clubhouse renovations that amounted to a new coat of paint. My instructions were simple: follow the money. Every dollar, every invoice, every check. I wanted to know where it all went. I had a feeling Brenda's meticulously maintained white Range Rover wasn't the only thing being paid for by suspicious funds. While the accountants sharpened their pencils, I began my own quiet reconnaissance. I started taking morning walks around the neighborhood, striking up conversations with my neighbors. I didn't mention my fight with Brenda directly. I just listened. And people talked. They talked about the special assessments that never seemed to result in any visible improvements. They talked about Brenda's brother-in-law, who just so happened to own Lakeside, the landscaping company with the exclusive, non-negotiable contract. They talked about how Brenda had single-handedly pushed through a $500 per household shoreline preservation fee last year. Yet the only part of the shoreline that seemed to have been preserved was the stretch directly in front of her own mansion, where a fancy new retaining wall had been built. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of systemic, deeply rooted corruption. Brenda hadn't just overstepped her authority, she had turned the HOA into her personal piggy bank. My fight to save my boathouse had morphed into a full-blown crusade. I wasn't just defending my property anymore, I was liberating a captured state. The 30-day deadline on the lawyer's letter was ticking down. Brenda thought she was cornering me. In reality, she was just giving me a timeline for loading every single cannon in my arsenal. And the bombardment was going to be biblical. The forensic accountants delivered their preliminary report 2 weeks later. It arrived in a thick, spiral-bound volume that felt as heavy as a tombstone. As Arthur Fincher and I sat in my study, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, we opened it. What we found was worse, and therefore better, than I could have possibly imagined. It was a symphony of petty graft, blatant cronyism, and outright fraud, all orchestrated by Brenda. The report was my second smoking gun, and it was aimed directly at her. The accountants had done a masterful job. They had cross-referenced every expenditure with state business filings, public records, and even social media. The first major red flag was, as suspected, Lakeside Scapes. The company was indeed owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. Not only were their rates nearly double the market average for every service from lawn mowing to fertilization, but the accountants found something truly egregious. The HOA had paid Lakeside Scapes over $30,000 for the removal of 10 large pine trees that were supposedly diseased and a danger to public safety. There was just one problem. Those 10 trees were on Brenda's private property, creating a better lake view from her deck. She had used HOA funds to pay her own relative an inflated price to landscape her own yard. It got better. The clubhouse renovations were another scam. The contractor was a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box. By digging into the bank transfers, the accountants traced the payments from the HOA through the shell corp and into a private bank account. The owner of that account, Gary, Brenda's meek, silent husband. They had paid themselves nearly $50,000 for a job that a professional painter would have charged $10,000 for. But the masterpiece, the Mona Lisa of her corruption, was the Shoreline Preservation Fund. Last year's special assessment had netted the HOA nearly $100,000 from the homeowners. The stated purpose was to combat erosion along the community's common shoreline. As my neighbors had suspected, the work had been almost exclusively focused on the area around Brenda's property. The contractor hired for the job, Waterfront Solutions LLC, was, according to state records, founded just 2 months before the project began. Its sole registered agent was Gary. They had fabricated a problem, levied a tax on their neighbors, and then paid themselves to fix it on their own land. This wasn't just a breach of fiduciary duty. This was criminal fraud and embezzlement. Arthur Fincher, my lawyer, read through the summary with a grimly satisfied smile. He looked like a wolf who had just been handed the keys to a sheep farm. "James," he said, tapping the report with his finger, "this is exquisite. We have her on breach of contract with the master declaration, which is a civil matter. But this," he tapped the report again, harder this time, "this is wire fraud. This is embezzlement. We have invoices, we have bank statements, we have corporate filings." She didn't just break the rules, she broke the law, repeatedly. We now had a two-pronged strategy. The first was the shield, the master declaration that made my property untouchable. The second was the sword, the financial audit that proved Brenda's corruption. But simply sending another letter from a lawyer wouldn't be satisfying enough. Brenda had tried to publicly humiliate me and threaten my home. She operated in the realm of public perception and intimidation. Her downfall needed to be equally public. It needed to be a spectacle. We needed to set the stage for a final, decisive confrontation. The 30-day deadline from her lawyer was almost up. I knew she was expecting me to either cave and start demolition or ignore it, at which point she would dispatch her contractors. I decided to force her hand. The time for defense was over. It was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I hired a small, reputable crew of local craftsmen. Not a big construction company, but a team of artisans who specialized in historical restoration. I gave them the original 1,928 blueprints for the boathouse, and their first task was simple: begin the careful surgical removal of the old weathered cedar siding, preparing the frame for restoration. I made sure their truck was parked conspicuously in my driveway and that the sound of their hammers, a gentle, rhythmic tapping, would carry clearly across the water. It was a calculated provocation. A red flag waved in front of an already enraged bull. I didn't have to wait long. It was just after 10 a.m. on a beautiful Tuesday morning when I saw it. The white Range Rover, crunching to a halt at the end of my long driveway, followed closely by the ubiquitous golf cart. Brenda wasn't alone this time. She had Gary with her, who looked even more miserable than usual, and 2 of her board member cronies, a man and a woman who always flanked her at meetings like surly, unthinking bodyguards. Brenda practically launched herself out of the driver's seat, her face a mask of incandescent rage. She marched down my lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the soft turf, and stopped just short of the stone pathway where my crew was working. "Stop this immediately," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "You are in violation. I warned you. This is HOA common property, and you are conducting unapproved construction." My lead craftsman, a grizzled old-timer named Gus with hands like worn leather, looked at her, then at me. I gave him a calm nod. "Keep working, Gus. You're on my property, and you have my permission." The men went back to their work, their hammers resuming their steady beat. This dismissal of her authority seemed to break something inside Brenda. Her face went from red to a blotchy purple. "I am the president of this association. I am ordering you to stop. This structure is scheduled for demolition," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the boathouse. "Brenda," I said, walking calmly towards her, my hands in my pockets. "We've had this conversation. You have no authority here. This is my property." That, I pointed to the old stone marker embedded in the grass near her feet, "is my property line. You are currently trespassing." "Trespassing?" She laughed, a shrill, unhinged sound. "I am enforcing the community bylaws. You are the one breaking the rules. I gave you a 30-day notice. Time's up. You're arrogant, you're defiant, and you think you're above the law. Well, you're about to find out you're not." She pulled out her phone, her thumb jabbing at the screen with furious energy. "I am calling the police," she announced to the sky, as if addressing a heavenly tribunal. "I am calling the police to have you and your illegal workers removed from this property for trespassing and destruction of HOA assets." This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The public confrontation she craved, but on my terms. "Go ahead, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Call them. I think it's an excellent idea." Her cronies looked a little uncertain, but Brenda was too far gone in her righteous fury. She spoke into the phone, her voice dripping with melodrama, describing a rogue homeowner actively destroying community property and refusing to leave. Gary just stood there, wringing his hands, looking like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him. As she hung up the phone, a triumphant, venomous smile spread across her face. "They're on their way," she said with finality. "Let's see how smug you are in the back of a police car." I simply nodded and waited. I had a certified copy of the master declaration and my property deed in my jacket pocket. My phone had Arthur Fincher on speed dial. The trap had been sprung. The players were all on stage. Brenda thought she was the director of this little drama. She had no idea she was the main character in a tragedy of her own making, and the final act was about to begin. The wail of a distant siren grew steadily closer, a sound that in any other circumstance would have filled me with a sense of dread. Today, it sounded like an overture. Two county sheriff's department cruisers pulled up behind Brenda's illegally parked Range Rover, their lights flashing silently in the bright morning sun. Two deputies got out of the first car, a younger one with a crisp uniform and an eager look, and a senior NCO, a sergeant whose name tag read Miller. Sergeant Miller was a man in his late 50s with a calm, weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything the county had to offer, twice. He was exactly who I had hoped would respond. The Miller family had been in this county as long as the Northwoods. His grandfather had worked on one of my great-grandfather's logging crews. Brenda immediately scurried towards them, launching into a breathless, indignant tirade. "Thank God you're here, officers. This man," she pointed at me dramatically, "is destroying HOA property. We have sent him legal notices. We have ordered him to stop, and he is refusing to leave. He's trespassing and bringing in these workers to tear down a community asset." Sergeant Miller listened patiently, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Brenda's agitated posse, my calm and collected work crew, the boathouse, and me, standing quietly by the path. He walked over to me, his expression unreadable. The younger deputy stood back, arms crossed, looking stern. "Morning, sir," Sergeant Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "We've had a complaint about property destruction and trespassing. Can you tell me your side of the story?" "Good morning, Sergeant," I said calmly. "There's no story, really. This is my property. That is my boathouse. These men are working for me to restore it. The only people trespassing here," I gestured to Brenda and her group, "are them." Brenda let out a sound like a deflating balloon. "That's a lie. Officer, this entire shoreline is HOA common area. Our bylaws are very clear." Sergeant Miller held up a hand to silence her, never taking his eyes off me. "Ma'am, let me handle this. Sir, do you have any proof of ownership for this parcel?" I do, I said. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a slim folder. I handed him my property deed first. He looked it over, then looked at the stone survey marker at his feet. He then turned his gaze toward the main house. The point, he said, more to himself than to me. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. Your name's Northwood, isn't it? James Northwood, yes, I confirmed. He nodded slowly, a deep ancestral understanding dawning in his eyes. I thought so. My dad used to tell me stories about your grandfather. He handed the deed back. This all seems to be in order. This is your land. Brenda was practically vibrating with fury. But the HOA, the CC, ours. He is in violation. Well, that's a civil matter, ma'am, Miller said patiently. But even so, he looked at me. She's claiming HOA authority extends here. About that, I said, pulling the second document from my folder. This is a certified copy of the Eagle Landing Master Declaration, filed with the county in 1988. It's the document that created the HOA. I'd like to draw your attention to Clause 2.7 on page 4. I have it highlighted. Sergeant Miller took the document. He read the highlighted section, his eyebrows rising slightly. He read it again, then looked over at Brenda with a newfound expression of profound weariness. Ma'am, he said, his voice losing its patient edge and taking on a tone of official finality. According to the founding legal document of your own organization, this property, the founders' parcellis, explicitly and permanently exempt from any and all HOA rules and authority. The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda's face, which had been a mask of righteous fury, seemed to crumble. The color drained from it, leaving behind a pasty, shocked pallor. Her two board members exchanged panicked looks. Gary looked at his shoes as if they held the secrets to the universe. That can't be right, Brenda stammered. That's an old document. We have new bylaws. It must be fake. Ma'am, the sergeant said, holding up the paper, this has the county clerk's official seal and certification dated last week. It's as real as the ground we're standing on, which, I have to remind you, is Mr. Northwood's private property. He's correct. You are the one who is trespassing. He then made a move that sealed her fate. He took out his radio. Dispatch, can you get me Sheriff Evans on his cell, please? A moment later, his radio crackled. Sheriff, it's Miller. Yeah, I'm over at the point. The old Northwood estate. No, everything's fine. We've got a little HOA dispute here. Yeah, James Northwood. That's right. Listen, I've got the HOA president here claiming he's trespassing on his own land. Miller listened for a moment, a slight smile playing on his lips. Yeah, I figured as much. Okay. Will do, Sheriff. He clipped the radio back to his shoulder and looked directly at Brenda. His voice was now ice cold. That was Sheriff Evans. He sends his regards to Mr. Northwood, and he asked me to deliver a message to you. He said, and I quote, "The Northwood family owns half this county and built the other half. Tell her to apologize for wasting our time and get off his property before he decides to press charges." If Brenda's face could have fallen any further, it would have been on the floor. She was utterly, completely, and publicly defeated. The legal document was one thing. The direct, dismissive order from the highest law enforcement officer in the county was a public execution of her authority. Her power was derived from the illusion of absolute control, and that illusion had just been shattered in front of her followers. Now, Sergeant Miller continued, his voice leaving no room for argument, I'm not going to charge you with filing a false report, and Mr. Northwood has been gracious enough not to press trespassing charges. But you and your friends will leave this property, right now, and I don't want to get called back out here for this again. Are we clear? Brenda couldn't even form words. She just nodded, her jaw slack. She turned, walking like a robot back to her Range Rover, her cronies trailing behind her like defeated soldiers. Gary scrambled into the passenger seat, not even daring to look at her. They drove off without a backward glance. The siege was broken, the battle was won, but the war wasn't over. I had defended my castle. Now it was time to tear hers down, brick by corrupt brick. As Sergeant Miller tipped his hat to me and his cruisers pulled away, I turned to Gus. All right, Gus. I said with a smile. Let's get back to work. The sound of hammers on wood had never sounded so sweet. The public humiliation on my lawn was the beginning of the end for Brenda, but it wasn't the end itself. A bully like her, cornered and embarrassed, was still dangerous. Her power base, the HOA board, was still intact, and the corrupt financial structures she had built were still in place. Leaving her in power, even with her authority neutered in my direction, would be a disservice to the entire community. It was time to deliver the coup de grace. Using the powers granted to my family's company in the original master declaration, I had Arthur Fincher draft a notice for a special meeting of the Eagle Landing Homeowners Association. The declaration gave Northwood Development, as the original declarant, the right to call such a meeting under extraordinary circumstances, and I felt rampant corruption and systemic legal overreach qualified. The notice was sent to every single homeowner. It stated the agenda clearly: a review of the association's financial records, a clarification of the HOA's legal authority as per the Master Declaration, and a vote on the standing of the current board members. We booked the largest meeting room at the local community center, not the small HOA clubhouse. I wanted this to be on neutral ground, and I wanted there to be enough space for everyone. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the incident with the sheriff. In those 2 weeks, the story of what happened on my lawn had spread like wildfire. The version people heard was likely a simplified one. The HOA president tried to kick the founder's heir off his own land and got shut down by the sheriff, but it was effective. For the first time, people felt that Brenda was not invincible. The tide of public opinion was turning. The night of the meeting, the room was packed. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one place. There was a nervous, excited energy in the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. I sat at a long table at the front of the room with Arthur Fincher at my side. We had a projector and a large screen set up. On the table in front of me was a thick binder, the full, detailed forensic accounting report, complete with copies of fraudulent invoices, bank statements, and corporate filings linking everything back to Brenda and Gary. Brenda arrived with her remaining board members, trying to project an aura of confidence, but it was brittle. She sat at a table opposite us, her face a carefully constructed mask of indignation. She clearly intended to frame this meeting as a personal vendetta, an attack on her good name by a disgruntled homeowner who thought he was above the rules. She was about to find out this was not a trial of opinions, but a presentation of facts. I stood up and walked to the podium. The room fell silent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is James Northwood. For those who don't know me, my family founded this community. I called this meeting because I've become aware of some serious discrepancies between how this HOA was intended to operate and how it has been operating. This isn't about personality conflicts. It's about our rights as homeowners and the integrity of our community. I started simply. The first image on the projector screen was a high-resolution scan of Clause 2.7, the founder's parcel exemption. First, let's clear up a recent point of confusion. I said, my property, the point, is legally exempt from the HOA. This is not a loophole, it's a foundational rule of this community's existence. The HOA board was aware of this, or should have been, yet they chose to spend our money on legal threats against me based on authority they do not have. A murmur went through the crowd. I then moved on, displaying sections of the Master Declaration that strictly limited the board's power to levy fines and create new architectural rules without a supermajority vote of all homeowners' votes that had never taken place for most of doubt. Brenda's draconian rules. One by one, I was showing them that the cage they thought they were living in didn't actually have any bars. Then I moved to the main event. But this goes beyond legal overreach, I said, my voice turning grave. This is about the money we all pay in dues and assessments. I hired an independent, state-licensed forensic accounting firm to audit the HOA's finances for the past 3 years. I'm now going to share some of their findings. For the next 45 minutes, I took the community on a guided tour of Brenda's corruption. With each click of the remote, a new piece of evidence flashed on the screen. The $30,000 invoice from Lakeside Scapes for hazardous tree removal, followed by an aerial photograph of Brenda's property showing the newly cleared view to the lake. Followed by the state business filing showing the owner of Lakeside Scapes was her brother-in-law. Gasps rippled through the room. The $50,000 payment to Clubhouse Renovations LLC, followed by the corporate filing showing its P.O. Box address. Followed by the flowchart, tracing the money directly to a private bank account held by one Gary, her husband. Gary, sitting next to her, turned a shade of gray I had previously only seen on battleships. And finally, the grand finale, the Shoreline Preservation Fund. I showed them the bank statement with the nearly $100,000 balance from their special assessment. Then the invoice from Waterfront Solutions LLC for $98,000. Then the business filing showing Gary as the sole agent. And finally, a series of before and after photos. The before showed the entire community's crumbling common shoreline. The after showed a brand new, expensive-looking stone retaining wall. A beautiful wall. A wall that just happened to be built exclusively in front of Brenda and Gary's property. When that final image appeared on the screen, the room erupted. It was no longer quiet murmurs, but open outrage. People were on their feet, yelling, pointing at Brenda. They finally understood. Their petunia finds, their treehouse battlesit was all a distraction while she and her husband were literally stealing their money. Brenda tried to fight back. She stood up, shouting that the documents were forged, that this was a smear campaign, but her voice was drowned out by the angry shouts of her neighbors. Old Man Hemlock stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "You fined me $300 for my bird feeder, while you were paying your husband $100,000 of our money." Arthur Fincher stood and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his old-school lawyer's voice cutting through the noise. "In light of this evidence, which will be turned over to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning, Northwood Development is invoking its power under Section 12 of the Master Declaration. We are calling for an immediate vote of no confidence and the dissolution of the current board for gross negligence and criminal malfeasance." It wasn't even a contest. The vote was nearly unanimous. Brenda and her cronies were removed from the board in a humiliating public spectacle of their own creation. As the meeting broke up, people came up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me. They weren't just happy Brenda was gone, they were relieved to be free. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Arthur and I handed our entire file over to the DA. Within a month, Brenda and Gary were indicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Faced with a mountain of undeniable evidence, they pleaded guilty to lesser charges, were forced to pay over $200,000 in restitution to the HOA, and received 5 years of probation. The shame was too much for them. Their McMansion went up for sale, and they fled the county, leaving their white Range Rover behind. We helped the community elect a new interim board composed of reasonable, civic-minded people. Their first act was to hire a legitimate law firm to rewrite the bylaws to conform to the original Master Declaration, gutting all the ridiculous rules Brenda had put in place. The HOA went back to being what it was always meant to be, a quiet, boring entity that made sure the roads were plowed in winter and the clubhouse pool was clean in summer. The reign of terror was over. A few months later, my boathouse restoration was complete. It looked magnificent. A perfect replica of its 1928 glory, the new copper roof gleaming in the sun. I hosted a big barbecue for the whole neighborhood to celebrate. As I stood on my dock, watching kids cannonball into the lake and neighbors laugh and chat, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had come home seeking quiet, and instead, I had walked into a war. But by fighting it, by standing up to a petty tyrant and digging for the truth, I had found something better than quiet. I had found community. I had restored not just a building, but a neighborhood. And that was a foundation worth fighting for. Thanks for listening to my story. It just goes to show you that sometimes the biggest bullies have the weakest foundations. Never be afraid to start digging.